There's a version of you that walks into a room and doesn't try to be anything. No performance, no warm-up act, no mental scramble for the right opening line. And somehow, that version of you is the one people remember. Stay with me for the next 30 seconds because I'm about to tell you something that took me almost a decade and one deeply humbling dinner party to learn. For years, I thought people magnetism was a skill you built the way you'd build a muscle. Add more charm, add more wit, add more stories, more energy, more you. I genuinely believed that if I could just be interesting enough, likable enough, sharp enough, people would gravitate toward me the way people gravitate toward warmth on a cold night. So I chased it. I talked faster. I filled every silence like it was a hole I had to patch before someone noticed. I read rooms like exam papers, hunting for the right answer in people's eyebrows and half smiles. And it backfired every single time. The people who actually held a room, the ones strangers leaned toward without knowing why, weren't doing any of that. They were doing less, far less. And it drove me a little crazy because doing less isn't something anyone teaches you. That question cracked something open in me. And it's the same question this entire journey's going to answer for you. What if magnetism was never about adding more of yourself? What if it's about removing what leaks? Here's what's waiting for you in the pages ahead. You're going to learn why emotional containment is the real foundation of presence, not charisma. You're going to learn how your nervous system speaks before your mouth ever opens. You're going to learn why chasing approval, even in the smallest, most invisible ways, quietly kills your influence. You're going to learn why silence is one of the most underused status signals available to any human being. You're going to learn why boundaries build attraction instead of distance. You're going to learn the difference between speaking from emotion and speaking from certainty. You're going to learn why detachment, not intensity, is what creates real gravity. And by the end, you're going to understand what it actually means to become unshakable. This isn't a personality makeover. You don't need a new haircut, a new vocabulary, or a louder laugh. What you need is already inside you. It's just buried under years of over-explaining, overreacting, and overreaching for approval you never needed in the first place. Let's take it back. Let's take it slow. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Quiet Foundation Nobody Talks About. Let's start with a question that's going to feel a little uncomfortable, and I want you to actually sit with it instead of rushing past it. When was the last time you said something and then immediately added another sentence just to soften it? Not because you had more to say, because some small, nervous part of you needed to check if it landed okay. I want you to picture someone you know, maybe a coworker, an old friend, a cousin at a family gathering, who has this quality where they say very little, but when they do speak, the whole table goes quiet to listen, not because they're loud, not because they're funny in that performative look-at-me way, because there's a stillness around them that makes their words feel like they matter. That stillness has a name. It's called emotional containment, and it is the single most underrated foundation of presence. Here's the misunderstanding almost everyone makes, myself included for a long stretch of my 20s. Containment is not suppression. It's not becoming cold, guarded, or distant. It's not swallowing your feelings and pretending you're fine when you're not. Containment is about leaking less, and leaking, once you learn to spot it, is happening constantly around you. Think about the friend who laughs a beat too loud at a joke that wasn't really that funny. Think about the coworker who agrees with an idea in a meeting before they've even had time to actually think it through. Think about the person who, right after making a strong point, tacks on, "But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong," even though they clearly aren't unsure at all. None of that is dramatic. None of it screams insecurity, but it whispers it constantly in a frequency most people pick up on without even realizing they're picking up on anything at all. I remember this landing for me hard during a work dinner in a small Italian place with exposed brick walls and candles dripping wax onto old wine bottles. I was talking about a project I genuinely cared about. I had the numbers memorized. I had a great closing line ready. I was, by any normal measure, on. And halfway through, I noticed something that stung a little. People were nodding, politely, not leaning in. Nodding the way you nod at a stranger's vacation photos. Then a colleague, someone who barely said 10 words the entire dinner, mentioned something about the project almost in passing. Low voice, no flourish, no punchline. And the table actually shifted toward him. Forks paused midair. Someone asked a follow-up question before he'd even finished his sentence. That was the moment I stopped thinking about magnetism as a performance problem and started thinking about it as a leakage problem. Here's what I mean by leakage concretely. It's the extra sentence tacked onto a strong opinion. It's the reflexive laugh that shows up to smooth over a slightly awkward pause. It's explaining a joke because someone didn't laugh fast enough. It's the tiny scan of someone's face after you speak, hunting for a sign that you're still liked. None of it is loud. All of it is felt. People are not walking around consciously analyzing your syntax or your vocabulary. They're reading your emotional weather. And when that weather feels scattered, a little too eager, a little too fast, a little too needing of something, your presence loses its density. It becomes something people observe rather than something they're pulled toward. Now, here's the part that reframes everything. Containment creates gravity. When your emotional energy is scattered in every direction, there's nothing solid for anyone to lean against. But when it's gathered, held, intentional, even in something as small as the pace of your breathing, people feel something entirely different. They feel steady ground. And steady ground in a world that constantly feels like it's tilting is one of the rarest and most magnetic things a human being can offer another human being. Let's be honest about why leakage happens in the first place. Almost everyone wants, at some level, to be admired, approved of, reassured that they're doing fine. That desire isn't shameful. It's deeply, unavoidably human. The problem isn't the wanting. The problem is when the wanting starts steering the wheel without your permission, and it shows up in your tone, your pacing, your posture, the speed of your blinking, the way your voice climbs half an octave when you're nervous someone didn't like what you just said. I used to do something small that, once I noticed it, embarrassed me a little. After making a point in a conversation, I would immediately add a follow-up sentence, almost like a silent question. Was that okay? Are we still good? That extra sentence wasn't information. It was a plea disguised as a comment. And every single time I did it, I quietly handed away a bit of my own weight in that conversation. Let's define magnetism properly, because most people define it wrong. Magnetism is not the effect you create when you entertain someone. It's not the effect of being impressive, quick-witted, or dazzling. Magnetism is the effect created when someone else feels stable in your presence. Not thrilled, not dazzled. Stable. When you're emotionally contained, you stop rushing to fill every gap in a conversation. You stop treating silence like an enemy that needs to be defeated. You stop defending every piece of pushback like it's a personal attack. You stop oversharing your struggles in a desperate bid for closeness. You allow space to simply exist. And that space, counterintuitively, is what makes people move toward you instead of drifting off. Try this thought experiment. Picture two people at a party. One is animated, constantly reacting, constantly adjusting their energy to match whoever they're talking to, laughing at everything, agreeing with everyone. The other speaks less, listens more, and reacts a bit slower, as if they're actually processing what's being said instead of performing a reaction to it. Which one feels heavier in the room? Which one feels like they take up more emotional space even while saying less? Weight attracts. Lightness drifts. Containment is what gives your presence weight. Here's the layer underneath containment that most people miss entirely. You cannot contain your energy if your sense of worth is being rented out to other people's reactions in real time. If your stability depends on whether the room likes what you just said, you'll always be adjusting, checking, scanning. And that scanning, even when it's silent, even when nobody can name what they're seeing, is visible. Neediness has a frequency, and people pick it up whether they mean to or not. When I started practicing containment on purpose, it felt deeply unnatural at first. I had to physically stop myself from tacking on extra explanations. I had to sit through pauses that made my chest tighten a little, resisting the urge to jump in and rescue the moment. There were entire minutes where I wanted to say anything just to relieve the pressure building in my own head. And then something clicked that changed how I understood every social interaction I'd ever had. The tension I was feeling wasn't actually in the room. It was in me. The other person wasn't uncomfortable with the silence. I was. Once I learned to sit inside that discomfort without rescuing it, everything around me shifted. People held eye contact a little longer. They asked more follow-up questions. They stopped talking over me. The room didn't get louder to compensate. It got quieter, slower, more attentive. That's when the real principle revealed itself. Magnetism isn't about projecting outward. It's about compressing inward. When your emotional energy is gathered, not suppressed, but concentrated like light passed through a lens instead of scattered across a room, it becomes something people can actually feel the shape of. Scattered energy feels weak because there's nothing to hold on to. Concentrated energy feels powerful because it has edges, weight, presence. So here's your first principle, and it's the one every other chapter in this journey builds on top of. Before you try to attract anyone, stabilize yourself. Before you try to impress anyone, regulate yourself. Before you try to be interesting, contain yourself. Because the person who doesn't leak doesn't chase. And the person who doesn't chase is the one the room quietly orbits around. Chapter 2. Your body enters the room before you do. Here's something almost nobody tells you, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You don't walk into a room alone. Your nervous system walks in about 3 seconds ahead of you. Before you say a single word, before you extend a hand or crack a smile, your body has already broadcast your internal weather report. And the people around you are reading it whether they realize it or not. This is why two people can say the exact same sentence word for word, and one of them sounds confident, while the other sounds like they're bracing for rejection. It was never about the words, it was about the regulation underneath them. I discovered this the hard way, in a way that honestly annoyed me a little at the time. I had already gotten good at containment. I was saying less, pausing more, letting silence exist without panicking. And yet, something still felt slightly off in certain rooms, especially high-stakes ones. My voice would tighten just a touch. My breathing would go shallow without my permission. My shoulders would creep toward my ears like they were trying to protect my neck from something. On the outside, I looked composed. On the inside, my nervous system was still sprinting, and fast energy, no matter how well you've mastered your words, reads as unstable. Here's a truth most self-help content skips over, because it's less flattering than just be confident. Magnetism is biological before it's psychological. When your nervous system is dysregulated, anxious, rushed, hyper-alert, your body leaks it through channels you don't consciously control. A slight tension in the jaw. Fingers that won't stay still. Speech that runs a half step faster than it needs to. A laugh that arrives a beat too early, like it's trying to get ahead of an awkward silence before it happens. None of these signals are dramatic on their own, but stacked together, they create an unmistakable impression. Unsettled. And unsettled energy, no matter how brilliant your vocabulary is, doesn't create gravity. Think back to the most grounded person you've ever personally known. Maybe a mentor, a grandparent, an old boss who never seemed to panic no matter what was on fire that day. What actually made them feel powerful wasn't volume. It wasn't charisma in the traditional sparkly sense. It was pace. Their movements weren't rushed. Their breathing looked unbothered even under pressure. Their responses arrived a beat later than everyone else's, like they were actually considering what was said instead of reflexively reacting to it. Their eyes didn't dart around the room hunting for the next thing to react to. They were, in every visible way, regulated. And regulation is what creates safety. Safety is what creates attraction. Here's the mechanism behind it, and it's worth understanding because it explains so much of human behavior. The human brain, underneath all its sophistication, is constantly scanning its environment for threat and for stability, the same way it's done for tens of thousands of years. This scanning is subconscious. Nobody's consciously thinking, is this person a threat? At a dinner party? But when someone appears rushed, jittery, or reactive, the brain quietly logs a small note. Instability. And when someone appears calm, unhurried, and steady, the brain relaxes a fraction. People are pulled, almost against their will, toward whatever helps them relax. That's why emotional regulation isn't just self-control. It's influence, disguised as calm. I ran a small experiment on myself once, mostly out of curiosity, before walking into a tense negotiation at a client's office downtown. The kind of glass and steel building where everyone seems to be moving 3 steps ahead of you. Instead of rehearsing my talking points one more time in the elevator, I did something different. I slowed my breathing. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds held, 6 seconds out. I did it for 2 full minutes while staring at the numbers ticking upward on the elevator display. Nothing dramatic happened internally. I didn't suddenly feel like a different person. But externally, something clearly shifted. My voice dropped a fraction. My shoulders released a tension I hadn't noticed I was carrying. My movements slowed just slightly, and the room responded differently than it usually did. People didn't interrupt as often. They didn't rush the conversation toward its conclusion. They actually listened in that specific way where you can feel someone's attention has stopped drifting. Calm energy, it turns out, sets the tempo for everyone else in the room. Most people walk in and instinctively try to match whatever energy is already there. Magnetic people walk in and, without announcing it, quietly become the tempo everyone else adjusts to. That's not a small difference. It's the whole difference. When your nervous system is reactive, you end up mirroring the room. When your nervous system is regulated, the room starts mirroring you. That's not a trick. That's simply how regulated presence works on a biological level. So why are most people dysregulated in social situations to begin with? Usually because they're overly attached to outcome. They care how they're being perceived. They care whether they're liked, whether they said the right thing, whether that joke landed the way they hoped. That subtle, constant caring activates urgency. Urgency speeds up the nervous system. Speed erodes stability. And reduced stability quietly erodes magnetism, no matter how well crafted your words are. This is why chasing a good impression almost always backfires. The harder you try to manage how you're perceived, the more your body leaks the exact insecurity you're trying to hide. So here's the shift I want you to make, starting today. Stop rehearsing words. Start regulating your state. Before any conversation that matters to you, a first date, a job interview, a difficult conversation with someone you love, slow your breathing on purpose. Lower the internal urgency, even by 10%. Relax your jaw. Unclench your hands, which are probably tighter than you realize right now as you're reading this. Reduce your speech pace by roughly 15 to 20%. This single shift will elevate your perceived presence more than any clever line or rehearsed story ever could. Because presence isn't primarily verbal, it's physiological. There's another layer worth understanding here. When your nervous system calms, your reactions naturally slow down. And when your reactions slow, you create space. And space reads as intelligence. Think about it from the outside. When someone answers a question instantly, it can feel impulsive, almost reflexive. When someone pauses, genuinely considers, and then responds, it feels deliberate. Deliberate feels powerful. Reactive feels breakable. Slowness, done right, is not weakness. It's control. But it has to be earned through actual internal regulation, not performed as a technique, because people can sense the difference between genuine calm and a rehearsed imitation of calm the same way you can tell the difference between a real smile and a polite one. Biological stability can't be faked. It has to be trained, the same way you'd train a muscle. So here's your practice for the next 3 days. Don't focus on being interesting. Focus on being unhurried. Walk about 10% slower than you normally would. Speak about 15% slower. Before you respond to something, count 2 full seconds in your head first, before you walk into any room, a meeting, a party, your own kitchen after a long day. Take 1 deliberate breath first. Watch what happens. You'll likely notice something quietly remarkable. Conversations start to orbit around you, not because you're dominating them, but because you become the steadiest point in the room. And stabilization, more than any communication trick ever taught in a seminar, creates leadership without a single ounce of effort. Your nervous system is the actual foundation everything else in this journey sits on top of. Master that. And magnetism stops being something you chase. It becomes something you simply are. Chapter 3. The approval you didn't know you were begging for. There's a form of neediness so quiet, so well disguised, that most people never catch themselves doing it. It doesn't look desperate. It doesn't look clingy. On the surface, it looks completely normal, even friendly. It's called micro-approval seeking. And once you learn to spot it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. In your own conversations, in your friends, in strangers, at coffee shops. It's the quick glance you throw after making a statement, hunting for a nod. It's the small laugh tacked onto the end of a serious sentence, just in case it landed too heavy. It's the, dropped at the end of an opinion, almost like a request for permission. It's the way your voice softens the moment you sense even a flicker of disagreement. None of these are dramatic on their own, but together, quietly, relentlessly, they erode magnetism from the inside out. Because every time you seek approval, even in these microscopic, almost invisible ways, you shift the balance of power in the interaction. Instead of standing behind what you said, you hand it over to someone else for grading. And validation seeking, no matter how gently it's dressed up, signals uncertainty. Uncertainty is quietly repellent. I didn't realize how often I was doing this until I forced myself to actually watch my own conversations without flinching away from what I saw. After I'd say something, my eyes would immediately dart across the faces around me. Was that too much? Did that land? Are they still with me? That scanning created a subtle static in the room. Nothing anyone could name out loud, but something everyone quietly felt. Every time you look for approval, you're broadcasting one clear message. I need your reaction to feel okay about what I just said. And the second someone else needs to stabilize you, your own presence loses its footing. Here's the distinction that matters. Magnetic people don't avoid feedback. They simply don't lean on it in real time. There's a real difference. They say what they actually mean. They let it sit in the air without chasing it. They don't rush to soften it the moment they sense a raised eyebrow. They let silence exist after a statement instead of scrambling to patch it. That stillness reads as strength, even though it's really just the absence of panic. Let's talk about why this habit is so common in the first place, because it's not a character flaw. It's practically built into us. Humans are wired for social survival. For most of human history, approval meant belonging, and belonging meant safety. Sometimes, literally, survival. So your brain quietly nudges you to check for alignment with the group, constantly, almost like a background app running without your permission. But here's the modern twist. Constant alignment kills attraction. If you adapt too fast, agree too easily, sand down every edge of your own personality to keep the peace, you become predictable. And predictability, while comfortable, quietly drains intrigue. Intrigue is what makes people lean in. To be clear, this isn't a call to become disagreeable or cold. It's a call to stop over-calibrating. There's a real difference between the two. Over-calibration looks like changing your opinion mid-sentence because someone's face shifted slightly. It looks like over-explaining a joke because the laugh didn't come fast enough. It looks like tacking, "I might be totally wrong, but," onto every strong point you make as a kind of preemptive apology for having a perspective at all. These habits, small as they seem, all communicate the same underlying message. I don't fully stand behind myself. And when you don't stand behind yourself, it becomes very hard for anyone else to either. I remember practicing something that felt almost physically uncomfortable at first. After making a point in a conversation over coffee with a close friend, I forced myself to simply stop. No extra words tacked on, no justification, no scanning her face for a verdict, just silence. My body wanted badly to soften the edge of what I'd said. My jaw actually tightened with the effort of holding back. But something interesting happened in that silence. My words gained weight instead of losing it. Instead of rushing past what I'd said, she actually sat with it. She nodded slowly, asked a genuine follow-up question, and eventually pushed back a little, calmly. None of those reactions destabilized me. And that stability, more than anything I said, changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. When you stop seeking micro-approval, you're quietly signaling internal validation, the sense that your worth isn't up for a vote in this particular moment. Internal validation is rare in a culture built almost entirely on external feedback loops. And rare things, almost by definition, feel valuable. Micro-approval seeking isn't purely verbal either. It shows up physically too. A quick eyebrow raise, over-smiling, excessive nodding while someone else is talking, leaning in a beat too eagerly. These small movements broadcast eagerness, and eagerness, when it's unbalanced, reads as chasing. Magnetism quietly collapses the moment chasing begins, because chasing implies scarcity, and a visible scarcity of self-belief is one of the least attractive things a person can project, even unintentionally. So here's a question worth sitting with honestly. After you speak, do you feel settled, or do you feel a small current of anxiety about how it landed? That flicker of anxiety is the leak, and emotional leaks, however small, quietly weaken presence over time. The goal here isn't to stop caring about connection. It's to stop depending on instant reassurance to feel okay about yourself. You can care deeply about the people around you without needing them to immediately confirm that you're still liked. Here's a practical shift to try this week. Remove a few specific phrases from your vocabulary. You know? Does that make sense? I might be wrong, but say what you actually mean, and then let it breathe in the space you've created. Also, notice your reactive smiling, the kind that appears automatically to smooth over tension the moment it shows up. Smile because you genuinely feel it, not because you're trying to diffuse a moment. Tension isn't always something to eliminate. Sometimes tension creates intrigue. Sometimes it creates respect. Sometimes it creates the kind of depth that shallow, constantly smooth conversations never reach. When you rush to smooth every bit of tension, you also erase the intensity that would have made the moment memorable. This chapter was never about arrogance. It's about anchoring. When you stop quietly outsourcing your stability to other people's reactions, your presence strengthens almost automatically, without any extra effort on your part. Here's the truth underneath all of it. The person who stops seeking approval becomes the reference point in the room. And reference points don't chase alignment. Alignment gathers around them. You don't need everyone to agree with you. You need to remain steady when they don't. That steadiness is what reads as authority, and authority is what creates gravity. Chapter 4. The loudest silence in the room. Most people are quietly terrified of silence. Not because silence itself is dangerous. It's just a gap, a pause, a breath. But because silence exposes whatever insecurity has been hiding underneath the noise. The moment a conversation pauses, something uncomfortable starts happening internally for most of us. Your mind starts sprinting through worst-case scenarios. Did I say something wrong? Are they bored of me? Should I fill this? Is this awkward? And before you've even finished the thought, you're already filling the space. Another sentence, a light laugh, a sudden topic change, anything to break the tension. You tell yourself you're rescuing the interaction. In reality, you're quietly lowering your own perceived status. Here's something subtle but genuinely powerful. The person most comfortable with silence often holds the highest perceived authority in any given room. Think of a composed leader, a steady executive, someone with that unmistakable quiet gravity. They rarely rush to fill every gap in a conversation. They let pauses exist. They let their words settle before adding more. They let other people actually think. That pause is doing something important underneath the surface. It's signaling that they're not afraid of space, and fearlessness around space signals stability. Stability signals power. When you rush to fill every silence, you're broadcasting urgency, and urgency reads as discomfort. Discomfort quietly repels the exact magnetism you're trying to create. Let's go a little deeper into the mechanics of it. Silence creates 3 specific psychological effects on the people around you. It increases perceived intelligence because a pause before speaking feels deliberate, and deliberate reads as thoughtful. It increases perceived confidence because instant reactions feel impulsive, and impulsive reads as unstable. And it increases perceived emotional control because someone who doesn't need to fill every gap clearly isn't being driven by anxious urgency. Here's a truth most people quietly avoid facing. Silence only feels awkward when you're uncomfortable with yourself in that moment. If you're internally settled, silence feels neutral, even pleasant. If you're internally anxious, silence feels like a threat that has to be neutralized immediately. Which means, in a strange way, silence training is actually emotional training in disguise. I remember deliberately practicing this during a conversation on a friend's back porch one evening, string lights strung overhead, the kind of setting where conversations usually drift lazily from topic to topic. After making a point I actually believed in, instead of adding more, I simply stopped. I held eye contact, not aggressively, just steadily, the way you'd look at someone you trusted. The first few times I tried this, my whole body screamed at me to keep talking. My chest tightened. My brain scrambled for filler words like it was searching for an exit. But I stayed still, and something genuinely interesting happened. The other person leaned in slightly. Their response, when it came, was more thoughtful than usual. They elaborated further than they normally would have. Because silence, it turns out, creates space for someone else to step forward into. When you fill every gap yourself, you're quietly dominating all the available air. When you allow silence to exist, you create room for depth, and depth attracts people in a way cleverness never quite manages to. There's a subtle dynamic worth understanding here, too. Every interaction has a tempo, whether anyone notices it consciously or not. Most people unconsciously match the fastest energy present in a room. If someone's talking quickly, others speed up to keep pace. If someone laughs nervously, that nervous energy tends to spread. But if someone slows down deliberately, the room often follows their lead instead. Silence, used well, is how you quietly control tempo. Pausing before answering a question slows the whole rhythm. Letting someone finish completely before responding resets the pace for everyone. Allowing 2 full seconds after making a statement gives that statement weight it wouldn't have otherwise had. And weight, as we've already established, is what creates gravity. Here's an even more powerful application: silence after criticism. When someone challenges you and you immediately jump to defend yourself, you shrink in that moment, even if your argument is technically correct. When someone challenges you and you pause calmly before responding, you actually expand. That pause quietly communicates, "I am not threatened by this," and very little is more magnetic than someone who genuinely isn't easily rattled. To be clear, none of this is about becoming quiet all the time. That would just be a different kind of performance. It's about becoming intentional. You speak when you choose to. You pause when you choose to. You stop reacting purely on autopilot. Automatic behavior reads as low status. Controlled behavior reads as high status, even when the words themselves are identical. There's another layer worth naming. When you over-explain, you quietly dilute your own authority. Over-explaining usually comes from a fear of being misunderstood. But real presence tolerates a little misunderstanding because genuine strength doesn't require instant universal agreement to feel secure. Try this in your very next conversation. Say roughly 20% less than you normally would. Cut one explanation you don't actually need. Remove one extra sentence you'd usually add out of habit. After making a point, silently count 2 seconds before you speak again. Notice what shifts. You'll probably feel a little exposed at first. That's normal. But exposure without collapse is exactly how confidence gets built, one small pause at a time. There's something almost paradoxical about silence that's worth sitting with. The less you speak, the more weight people assign to what you actually say. The fewer words you use, the more carefully each one gets heard. The less you chase noise for its own sake, the more noticeable your presence becomes without you trying to make it so. Silence isn't emptiness. It's contained energy waiting to be directed. And contained energy, as we already covered, is what reads as powerful. Remember this clearly. The loudest person in any room is rarely the most magnetic one. The calmest person usually is. And calm is visible in stillness. Stillness is visible in silence. Chapter 5. What you say, no, to shapes what pulls toward you. There's a dangerous misunderstanding baked into a lot of advice about being likable. And it goes something like this. If you're agreeable enough, available enough, easygoing enough, people will naturally be drawn to you. So people say yes too quickly. They make themselves available at almost any hour. They adapt constantly to whoever they're with. They smooth over every hint of conflict before it can even fully form. And they genuinely believe this is building connection. In reality, it's quietly eroding value, because attraction was never really built on availability. It's built on selectivity. Selectivity signals standards. Standards signal self-respect. And self-respect, more than any amount of charm, is what creates real magnetism. Let's start with something a little uncomfortable to hear. If you're always accessible, you're rarely intriguing. If you're always agreeable, you're rarely memorable. If you're always accommodating, you're rarely respected, even by the people who benefit most from your accommodation. Boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out. They're filters. Quietly, without a single dramatic word, they communicate. My time carries weight. My energy has limits. My standards aren't up for negotiation just to keep the peace. And when people sense that, and they do sense it, even if they couldn't explain how, something shifts. They lean in a little more. They become more careful with you. They pay closer attention because what's limited tends to feel valuable, and what's endlessly available tends to feel ordinary. I used to respond to every text within minutes, no matter the context, no matter how minor. I told myself this made me reliable. What it actually communicated was constant availability. And constant availability quietly reduces perceived demand for your attention. When I started responding with intention instead of reflex, something subtle changed. People became more concise with me, more direct, more respectful of the time I did give them. Boundaries, it turns out, quietly reshape how people treat you. I want to be clear about something important here. Boundaries aren't about playing games or engineering scarcity for effect. They're about self-regulation. If you say yes when everything in you wants to say no, you leak power in that moment. If you laugh at something you don't actually find funny, you leak authenticity. If you nod along with something you internally disagree with, you leak alignment. Every time you betray your own internal signal to keep things smooth, your presence quietly weakens. And people feel that inconsistency even when they can't name exactly what they're sensing. Consistency is what builds trust. Trust is what builds attraction. Picture someone who says, calmly and without apology, "I'm not free tonight," or "I actually disagree with that," or "that doesn't work for me." No lengthy justification, no over-explaining, no hostility either, just clarity. That clarity reads as strength because it signals internal certainty. People who are unclear tend to drift through relationships and rooms. People who are clear tend to anchor themselves. And anchored people are the ones others naturally orbit around. There's another layer to boundaries worth naming. They create mystery. When you don't share every detail of your life immediately, when you don't explain every single decision you make, when you don't lay out all your plans for public review, people become genuinely curious about you. Curiosity increases engagement. Engagement over time becomes magnetism. Oversharing tends to eliminate intrigue almost entirely. Constant availability eliminates the small, healthy tension that actually draws people closer instead of letting them drift. Ask yourself something honestly, without judging what comes up. Do you sometimes lower your own standards just to keep harmony intact? Do you accept treatment you privately dislike just to avoid friction? Do you soften your real opinions just to keep things smooth on the surface? That smoothing might feel socially safer in the moment, but it slowly erodes your presence over time. Because, deep down, most people respect strength more than they value comfort, and real strength requires limits. Here's a shift worth making deliberately. Instead of asking yourself, "How do I make them like me?" start asking, "Does this actually align with me?" That small mental pivot changes your entire energy in a conversation. When you're evaluating instead of seeking approval, you quietly reverse the usual dynamic. You stop trying to earn entry into someone else's orbit and start deciding who gets access to yours. That shift, subtle as it sounds, is what creates real gravity. Boundaries also regulate your emotional energy in ways that ripple outward. If someone speaks to you disrespectfully and you just laugh it off to keep things light, you're sending a signal not only to them, but to your own nervous system. That discomfort must be quietly tolerated in order to maintain connection. Over time, that creates real internal instability. But when you calmly address it or simply disengage, you stabilize yourself in that moment. And stable energy, as we've established throughout this whole journey, is magnetic energy. To be completely clear, boundaries don't require aggression. They require steadiness. You don't need to raise your voice or issue an ultimatum. You simply state your position and hold it without flinching. Holding without shaking is what creates presence. Presence is what creates attraction. Here's a simple practice for the week ahead. Say no once. Somewhere you'd normally default to yes out of pure habit. State one opinion without immediately softening it. Delay one response instead of answering the instant you're asked. Watch what happens. You might feel a flicker of fear that people will pull away from you. And some might, honestly. But the people who stay will treat you differently because boundaries filter your environment, and filtering over time quietly refines it. Refinement increases perceived value in ways that are hard to fake any other way. Remember this clearly. If everyone has unlimited access to you, you lose leverage without even realizing it. If everything about you is negotiable, you lose weight in every interaction. But when your access is intentional and your standards are visible, your presence strengthens on its own without you having to perform anything at all. You don't become magnetic by trying to be everything to everyone. You become magnetic by staying anchored in yourself, even when it costs you something in the moment. Chapter 6. Speaking like you actually mean it. There's a real, tangible difference between speaking from emotion and speaking from certainty, and once you start noticing it in others, you'll start noticing it in yourself too. Emotion is reactive. Certainty is anchored. When you speak from raw emotion, your tone fluctuates without your permission. Your pace shifts unpredictably. Your volume rises or drops in ways you might not even consciously register, but the people listening to you absolutely do. Emotion-driven speech tends to read as unstable, even when what you're saying is completely valid. Certainty-driven speech reads as grounded, and grounded speech carries real weight in any room. To be clear, emotion itself isn't a weakness. That's an important distinction. Unregulated emotion is the actual problem. If someone disagrees with you and you respond instantly, defending and justifying and explaining in a rush, your nervous system has quietly taken the wheel from you. But if someone challenges you and you pause, breathe, and respond with intention, something entirely different happens. You're signaling, without saying it out loud, I'm not threatened by this, and very little amplifies presence more reliably than emotional steadiness under real pressure. Think of someone whose words always feel solid to you. Not loud, not aggressive, just solid. Like a table that doesn't wobble no matter how much weight you put on it. Their tone stays fairly consistent. Their pace is measured, neither rushed nor artificially slow. They don't spiral into excitement over praise or collapse under criticism. Their words feel aligned with whatever's actually happening inside them. That alignment is what builds trust. Trust is what builds attraction. Now contrast that with someone who speaks with a lot of passion, but very little consistency. Excited one moment, defensive the next, over-explaining the second they're questioned, laughing nervously right after stating an opinion they clearly feel strongly about. That kind of emotional fluctuation quietly reduces perceived stability. And stability, as we've covered from nearly every angle in this journey, is the actual core of magnetism. I learned this lesson somewhat by accident. For a long stretch of time, I genuinely believed intensity was what made a person persuasive. If I felt strongly about something, I let it show fully. Faster speech, heavier emphasis, more words stacked on top of more words. And over time, I noticed a pattern. When I spoke with that kind of intensity, people either matched it right back at me or quietly resisted it. Very few people ever leaned in calmly, so I tried something different. Instead of increasing my energy when I felt strongly about something, I deliberately reduced it. Slower tone, lower volume, fewer words, and suddenly people listened far more carefully than they ever had before, because certainty, it turns out, doesn't need volume to be heard. Certainty doesn't rush. It doesn't plead for agreement. It simply states what it means and lets that be enough. Here's a small but important distinction worth examining. Saying, "I think this might possibly be the best option," feels tentative, almost apologetic. Saying, "This is the best option," feels anchored and clear. The gap between those two sentences is small in wording, but enormous in impact. Try removing unnecessary qualifiers from your own speech this week. Phrases like, "I feel like," "maybe," "I could be wrong," but "just my opinion," but. If you genuinely stand behind a thought, own it plainly, and if you don't fully stand behind it yet, it's okay to simply not say it until you do. Silence in that case is stronger than weak, hedged speech. There's another crucial element here: emotional timing. Never respond at the exact peak of your own emotion. If anger is rising in you, wait it out. If defensiveness is building, pause before you speak. If urgency to prove your point is pulling at you, slow yourself down deliberately. Because the moment emotion fully takes the wheel, your presence quietly shrinks. And it only returns once your tempo slows back down. Here's a reframe worth carrying with you. Instead of trying to win conversations, aim to remain stable within them. Winning tends to read as dominance. Stability reads as genuine power. Dominance often triggers quiet resistance in people, even when they don't voice it. Power, expressed through steadiness, tends to command respect instead. When you speak from certainty, you're not chasing agreement from the room. You don't need applause. You don't rush to clarify yourself the moment someone looks confused. You let your words stand on their own 2 feet, and that independence is what creates intrigue. People trust those who visibly trust themselves, and self-trust is audible in ways you might not expect. It's in the pauses you allow, the tone you use, the near-total absence of over-explanation. Let's go one layer deeper still. Certainty is not the same thing as arrogance, even though they can look similar from a distance. Arrogance is loud insecurity wearing a confident mask. Certainty is quiet alignment between what you believe and what you say. Arrogance pushes at people. Certainty simply holds its ground without needing to push at all. When someone challenges a genuinely certain person, they don't flinch, they don't escalate, and they don't shrink. They respond calmly, or sometimes they simply let the challenge pass without responding at all. That non-reactivity is what amplifies their gravity, because gravity, at its core, is built through control, not over other people, but over yourself. Here's a practical exercise for the days ahead. Lower your speaking volume very slightly. Slow your speech by roughly 10 to 15%. Remove one habitual qualifier from every conversation you have. Pause for one full breath before responding to any disagreement that comes your way. Notice the shift as you practice this. You'll probably feel a little exposed at first. Reduced emotional intensity can feel at first like reduced personality. But what replaces that intensity is weight. And weight, as we've said throughout, is what attracts. Remember this: emotion is temporary, but certainty is stable. Magnetism, at its foundation, is built on stability far more than it's built on passion. Chapter 7. The freedom of not needing it to go well. There's a quiet internal shift that changes almost everything once you find it. The moment you genuinely stop needing a specific outcome, your presence becomes heavier in the best possible sense. Most people walk into interactions wanting something, whether they'd admit it out loud or not. Approval, agreement, attention, connection, validation. Even when it's never spoken, the nervous system is quietly chasing a result underneath the surface. And chasing, no matter how subtle, reduces magnetism almost instantly. Because when you need something from an interaction, you tighten, your voice shifts slightly, your posture adjusts, often without your awareness, your energy leans forward toward the outcome you're hoping for. That leaning is subtle, but it signals pursuit, and pursuit quietly reverses the pull you're actually trying to create. Let's be precise about what detachment actually means here, because it gets misunderstood constantly. Detachment doesn't mean indifference. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means emotional independence from the outcome specifically. You still show up fully. You still engage, still care, still participate with your whole self. But your internal stability no longer depends on how things unfold afterward. That combination, full engagement plus outcome independence, is genuinely rare. And rare energy is what people find themselves drawn to almost without knowing why. I remember a conversation that used to make me nervous for days in advance. A high-stakes discussion with someone whose opinion of me mattered a great deal to me at the time. In the past, I would have rehearsed exactly what to say. I would have mentally war-gamed every possible objection. I would have walked in already braced for how it might go wrong. This time, I tried something different. Before walking in, I told myself, quietly and deliberately, I don't need this to go perfectly. That single internal sentence changed my physiology almost immediately. My breathing slowed on its own. My shoulders dropped. The urgency I usually carried into rooms like that simply wasn't there. And the conversation itself flowed in a completely different way. Because I wasn't chasing an outcome anymore. I was simply present inside the conversation as it actually unfolded. Here's the psychological mechanism underneath that shift. When you detach from outcome, your nervous system calms. When your nervous system calms, your energy stabilizes. When your energy stabilizes, the people around you feel safe in your presence. And safety, as we've established from nearly every angle now, is deeply magnetic. Picture someone who doesn't need you to agree with them, not in an arrogant, dismissive way, but in a grounded, unbothered way. They share their perspective clearly. If you disagree, they don't crumble or backpedal. If you walk away from the conversation, they don't chase after you to fix it. If you criticize their idea, they don't escalate defensively. They simply remain internally anchored, the same before your reaction as after it. That steadiness creates real gravity, because gravity comes from density, and density comes from internal solidity that doesn't depend on external confirmation. Now compare that to someone visibly hungry for approval. They monitor every reaction closely. They adjust their statements mid-sentence at the first sign of hesitation. They soften every opinion the moment it meets resistance. They rush to repair the smallest hint of tension the instant it appears. Their energy, however well-intentioned, feels light, and light energy tends to drift rather than pull. Heavy, grounded energy is what actually pulls people closer. Here's another layer worth understanding. When you need something from an interaction, you tend to unconsciously overinvest in it. You talk more than necessary. You explain more than necessary. You smile more, lean in more, become a slightly exaggerated version of yourself without realizing it. And exaggeration, however well-meaning, tends to read as unstable. But when you're genuinely detached from the outcome, you naturally conserve your energy instead. You speak when it's actually necessary. You respond when it's genuinely appropriate. You don't overextend yourself trying to secure a particular result. That conservation of energy reads as quiet power. Magnetic people, almost without exception, don't overinvest early in a relationship or a conversation. They let things unfold at their own pace. They don't rush intimacy. They don't rush agreement. They don't rush decisions that deserve real time. Because rushing is almost always a symptom of attachment. And attachment, however hidden, creates a visible, palpable tension that other people feel even if they can't name it. Let's talk about something subtle but genuinely important. When you detach from outcome, rejection loses most of its power over you. If someone doesn't respond the way you'd hoped, you remain the same person you were before. If someone doesn't validate your idea the way you wanted, you remain the same. If someone loses interest in continuing the conversation, you remain the same. That consistency over time builds a quiet aura of emotional independence around you. And emotional independence is deeply attractive because people are instinctively drawn to those who aren't easily shaken by circumstance. There's a paradox worth sitting with here. The less you need someone's attention, the more attention you often end up receiving, almost as a side effect rather than a goal. The less you chase respect directly, the more respect tends to arrive on its own. The less you actively seek validation, the more it seems to show up naturally in its own time. Not because of any manipulation on your part, but simply because neediness dissolves and stability remains visible in its place. Detachment also sharpens your decision-making in ways that ripple outward into every part of your life. When you're attached to a particular outcome, you tend to quietly compromise your own standards to protect it. When you're detached, you can evaluate situations far more clearly without that pressure distorting your judgment. That clarity shifts the entire dynamic. Instead of constantly asking, "Do they like me?" you begin asking, "Is this actually aligned with who I am?" That reversal, subtle as it sounds, increases your perceived value almost immediately, because you're no longer seeking entry into someone else's world. You're quietly deciding who gets access to yours. Here's a practice worth carrying into the week ahead. Before any interaction that matters to you, ask yourself honestly, if this doesn't go the way I want, will I still be okay? If the honest answer is no, regulate yourself first. Detach from the specific outcome first. Remind yourself gently but firmly that your identity doesn't actually depend on how this one moment unfolds. When your identity is independent of any single outcome, your presence strengthens on its own. And when your presence strengthens, magnetism naturally follows. There's something even more subtle about detachment worth mentioning before we move on. It changes how you sit with uncertainty itself. When you're attached to an outcome, waiting for a response becomes genuinely stressful. You check your phone more than you'd like to admit. You replay conversations in your head looking for hidden meaning. You overanalyze tone and timing until it exhausts you. But when you're truly detached, waiting becomes neutral, almost peaceful. You send the message, you make the ask, you express the interest, and then you release it fully without the mental replay loop chasing behind it. That calm neutrality communicates real strength because emotionally independent people don't chase resolution. They allow resolution to arrive in its own time. Attachment, in almost every form, feels like subtle pressure to the people around you, even when it's never spoken aloud. Detachment feels like freedom, and people are consistently, quietly drawn toward freedom rather than pressure. When someone senses that you don't need them to behave a particular way, they relax around you. When they relax, they open up. When they open up, real connection has room to deepen naturally without being forced. That's the entire point. Detachment was never about pulling away emotionally. It's about removing pressure from the space between you and everyone you interact with. And when your presence carries no pressure, only steadiness, people move closer without ever feeling pushed. Chapter 8. What it means to become unshakable. There's a level of presence that sits beyond confidence, beyond charisma, beyond even the sharpest communication skills. It's the state of being genuinely unshakable, not emotionless, not cold, not distant, unshakable. Someone who's truly unshakable doesn't collapse under praise, and they don't crumble under criticism either. They don't inflate when they're admired, and they don't shrink when they're challenged. Their internal center stays intact no matter which direction the wind is blowing that day. That center is the true core of magnetism, because people are instinctively drawn toward stability. In a world that so often feels like it's tilting under their feet, think about what actually makes someone feel powerful in a room. It's rarely volume, it's rarely dominance, it's rarely non-stop talking. It's composure under pressure. When tension rises around them, they remain steady. When disagreement appears, they stay grounded instead of escalating. When attention drifts away from them toward someone else, they don't chase it back. That steadiness creates real gravity, because gravity is built through consistency over time, not through a single impressive moment. Here's an uncomfortable truth worth sitting with. Most people are externally controlled without realizing it. Their mood depends heavily on how they're treated in any given moment. Their confidence depends on how well they're received. Their entire energy depends on how a room happens to react to them. That's a fragile kind of presence. And fragile presence can't be genuinely magnetic, because magnetism requires density, and density requires internal anchoring that doesn't sway with every shift in the wind. An unshakable person doesn't outsource their internal state to whoever happens to be in the room. They self-regulate from the inside. If someone dismisses them, they remain the same. If someone praises them excessively, they remain the same. If someone challenges them aggressively, they remain the same. That emotional consistency feels rare in a world full of reactive people, and rare things, almost universally, feel valuable. I remember noticing a subtle but meaningful shift in myself over time. In the past, if someone disagreed strongly with something I said, I felt an immediate surge inside me, a need to clarify, to defend, to correct the record on the spot. But as I practiced everything covered so far in this journey, containment, regulation, silence, boundaries, certainty, detachment, something genuinely changed. The surge still arrived, exactly as before, but it no longer controlled me the way it used to. I could feel the emotion rising and choose not to move with it immediately. That small pause between feeling something and reacting to it is exactly where unshakable presence gets built, one moment at a time. It was never about eliminating emotion entirely. It's about no longer being governed by it in the moment it shows up. There's enormous quiet power in that pause. Because when someone tries to provoke a reaction from you and you don't take the bait impulsively, the entire dynamic shifts instantly. You're no longer caught inside the emotional current of the moment. You're observing it from slightly outside. And observers, almost without exception, hold the higher ground in any interaction. Let's go a layer deeper still. Unshakable presence also means you stop adjusting your identity to fit whatever room you happen to walk into. You don't shrink yourself to avoid intimidating someone. You don't inflate yourself to compete with someone else's energy. You remain consistent across contexts, and that consistency builds trust over time in a way that's hard to fake. People begin to know exactly what they're getting with you. No wild volatility, no dramatic emotional swings, no unpredictability that keeps them guessing. Predictability of character, not predictability of behavior, is what builds real respect. And respect, cultivated over time, builds lasting attraction. There's something else worth naming here. When you're genuinely unshakable, you stop chasing control over how you're perceived. You stop trying to manage every single impression you make. You let perception form naturally around you because your internal state stays stable, regardless of what anyone concludes about you in a given moment. That release of control removes a huge amount of tension from your interactions, and tension removal consistently increases magnetism. Here's something powerful worth internalizing fully. If someone can move you emotionally without much effort, they have a certain kind of control over you in that moment. If someone can't move you easily, you retain control over yourself. Self-control is visible to other people even when it's never announced. Visible self-control signals real strength. Strength signals safety. And safety, as we've circled back to throughout this entire journey, is what people find themselves magnetically drawn toward. Becoming unshakable isn't dramatic in practice. It's actually quite subtle. It's walking into a room without adjusting your breathing to fit the mood. It's speaking without scanning the crowd for validation first. It's holding eye contact without needing to prove anything through it. It's hearing criticism without immediately defending yourself. It's receiving genuine praise without letting it inflate you. It's remaining centered even as the energy around you shifts unpredictably. That centering, more than anything else, is what creates gravity. And gravity pulls without any visible effort at all. Let's tie the whole journey together now, piece by piece. Containment prevents your emotional leaks. Regulation stabilizes your nervous system underneath everything else. Silence increases the weight of your words. Boundaries create real value around your presence. Certainty strengthens the way you speak. Detachment removes pressure from every interaction you're part of. And unshakable presence integrates all 6 of these into a single, coherent way of moving through the world. At that point, you're no longer trying to be magnetic in any active sense. You simply are. The way a lighthouse doesn't try to attract ships, It just stands steady on the rocks, and ships find their way by it anyway. Because magnetism was never really something you project outward. It's something that happens naturally when your internal world stops fluctuating wildly with the external one around it. And when you finally reach that state, something remarkable settles in. You stop wondering whether people feel your presence. You start feeling your own presence clearly on your own terms. And that internal solidity, more than anything else covered in this entire journey, is the highest form of attraction available to any human being. There's one final layer to becoming unshakable that most people overlook entirely, and it might be the most important one of all: identity. If you still quietly see yourself as someone who needs approval to feel okay, you'll react whenever approval feels threatened. If you still see yourself as someone who must constantly prove their value, you'll tense up whenever your value gets questioned. If you still see yourself as someone who must be liked at all costs, you'll adjust yourself the moment likability feels remotely uncertain. Behavior almost always follows identity underneath the surface. You can't consistently act unshakable while still privately identifying as fragile inside. So here's the real shift underneath everything else in this journey. Stop seeing yourself as a performer walking into a room, and start seeing yourself as a stable presence moving through it. That subtle internal redefinition changes nearly everything that follows. You're no longer there to win people over. You're no longer there to impress anyone specifically. You're no longer there to secure a particular position for yourself. You're simply there, as you actually are, anchored to something inside yourself that doesn't depend on the room's approval. When your identity shifts from seeking to standing, your nervous system calms almost automatically, because you're no longer negotiating your own worth in real time with every person you meet. And when your worth isn't being negotiated moment to moment, your reactions naturally slow down. Slower reactions increase your control. Increased control increases your density. And density, as we've said from the very beginning of this journey, is what creates gravity. At that point, magnetism stops being an effort you make. It becomes a simple byproduct of who you already are. You don't think consciously about eye contact. You hold it naturally without strain. You don't force silence into a conversation. You allow it to exist because it doesn't scare you anymore. You don't manufacture certainty in your voice. You speak from genuine alignment with what you actually believe. You don't fake detachment as a technique. You genuinely no longer need a specific outcome to feel okay. And when that alignment becomes your consistent baseline rather than an occasional practice, something powerful starts happening around you. People begin adjusting to your pace instead of the other way around. The room quietly calibrates around your stability. Conversations slow down to match your tempo. Energy in the space settles near your presence, not because you're dominating anyone, but simply because you're not moving erratically the way everyone else tends to. And in a world where nearly everyone is constantly reacting to everything around them, the person who remains steady naturally becomes the reference point everyone else orients around. Reference points, without ever asking for it, attract orbit. That's what it genuinely means to be unshakable, not loud, not cold, not distant, simply centered. And centered people pull others toward them without ever having to push. Bringing it all together, there was a version of me that genuinely believed magnetism had to be built outward, brick by brick, Better stories, better posture, sharper timing, quicker wit. I thought if I could just polish the surface enough, people would naturally lean toward me the way you'd lean toward a warm fire on a cold evening. But what actually changed everything for me wasn't anything I added. It was everything I finally removed. I removed the urgency that used to color almost every interaction I had. I removed the constant low-level need for approval that I didn't even realize I was carrying around like extra weight. I removed the habit of over-explaining myself the moment I sensed the smallest flicker of doubt on someone's face. I removed the fear of silence that had quietly shaped how I spoke for most of my adult life. And what remained, once all of that was gone, was simple steadiness. That steadiness changed how rooms felt when I walked into them. It changed how conversations unfolded around me without me trying to steer them any harder than before. It changed how people responded to me without me ever having to try harder to earn that response. And that's the exact point I want to leave you with, because it's the entire message wrapped into a single idea. You don't become a people magnet by increasing your performance. You become one by decreasing your instability. Think back through everything we walked through together. Emotional containment, so you stop leaking your inner state into every interaction. Nervous system regulation, so you stop rushing through your own life. Silence, so your words finally carry the weight they deserve. Boundaries, so your presence carries real value instead of endless availability. Certainty, so your speech carries solidity instead of hedging. Detachment, so your energy stops carrying pressure into every room you enter. And unshakable identity, so your sense of worth is never up for negotiation again. None of these require you to become louder, flashier, or more impressive than you already are. They simply require you to become steadier. And steadiness in a world where almost everyone is reacting instantly, over-explaining constantly, and quietly chasing validation in 100 small ways is genuinely rare. In a room full of noise, the person who doesn't chase tends to stand out, not aggressively, but gravitationally, the way a single still point draws the eye in a busy scene. There's something powerful about walking into a room without adjusting yourself to fit it, without scanning faces for reassurance, without performing to secure your place, simply standing there, present and anchored in yourself. When you do that consistently, something inside you shifts. You stop asking, "Do they feel my presence?" And you start feeling your own presence clearly for the first time in a long time. That's the real transformation this entire journey has been pointing toward. Magnetism was never really about being noticed by other people. It's about being internally stable, whether you're noticed in a given moment or not. Because once your internal state stops, depending on the room eventually starts responding to your state instead. Here's where this becomes genuinely practical starting today. For the next 72 hours, try 3 specific things. On the first day, slow everything down by roughly 15%. Your speech, your movements, your reactions, not dramatically, just intentionally, like you're finally giving yourself permission to stop rushing. On the second day, remove one approval habit you've noticed in yourself. No, tacked onto the end of your sentences. No extra explanation after you've already made a clear point. No softening of a statement you genuinely believe. On the third day, protect your silence deliberately. After making a point, pause instead of rushing forward. After being challenged, breathe before you respond. After being praised, stay neutral instead of overreacting either way. Notice what changes, not just in how people respond to you, but internally in how you experience these small moments. You'll probably notice some discomfort at first. That discomfort is simply your old patterns loosening their grip. And on the other side of that discomfort is real stability. The more stable you become, the less you feel the need to prove anything to anyone. The less you need to prove, the more people naturally perceive your strength without you announcing it. And perception, at the end of the day, is what magnetism has always ridden on. One last thing, because it matters. None of this is about becoming cold. It's not about becoming distant or emotionally unavailable or disconnected from the people you actually care about. It's about removing pressure from your presence, because pressure repels quietly and reliably, while stability attracts just as quietly and just as reliably. If you take only one thing from everything we've covered together, let it be this. Magnetism was never about intensity, it's about control. Not control over other people, but control over yourself. And once you genuinely master that, you no longer have to try to be a people magnet. You stop chasing attention. You stop competing for it. You stop angling for it in 100 small, exhausting ways. You simply walk into spaces as a stable, grounded force. And stable forces, without exception, create their own gravity. From this point forward, don't focus on being impressive. Focus on being unshakable. Don't focus on being interesting. Focus on being regulated. Don't focus on attracting people toward you. Focus on stabilizing yourself, and let attraction follow as the natural byproduct it's always been meant to be. Because the moment you stop chasing attention, attention starts noticing you on its own. And the moment you stop performing presence, presence quietly becomes who you actually are. Let that be the shift you carry forward. Let that be the practice you return to, again and again, on the days it feels hardest. And let that be the standard you bring into every single room you walk into, starting right now.